around. This episode does a lot to set up Thomas and Gordon, and it has some very good sets that are reoccurring throughout the whole series. Gordon's theme is a jam, and so is that short turntable one at the end. However, where this episode fails me is the interest. I remember watching series 1 a lot as a child, and this would always be the first episode, so needless to say, it got old quickly. However, I still do like it, and I probably could memorise the episode line by line at this point. It's a very good prime episode that's simple and sticks as closely to the book adaptation as possible. However, compared to others on this list, it's a bit boring in the story aspect, but if you want episodes of just trains sticking around for like 5 minutes, this is actually a pretty good one.
The Sad Story of Henry is an entertaining gem, with every scene being at least somewhat entertaining. It's definitely a fun one to watch, and the beauty of this episode is down to the beautiful narration by either Ringo Starr or George Carlin. And the only downside is the minor thing that this episode all takes place in one setting, which can get a bit boring, but I think the characters and the model work easily makes up for it. Well, this is an aptly named episode. Edward, Gordon and Henry takes elements from the previous episodes. The Gordon scenes like in Thomas and Gordon, the Edward triumphing story from Edward and Gordon, ending the Henry story from the previous episode. These elements are all the best parts of the episodes prior, and thus this episode is amazing. The ending especially is pretty heartwarming for a season 1 episode. I always look forward to this episode when I watch season 1.
This episode has such a boring, basic concept that it's very just dull and lifeless. Some of the sets are nice. There's one set in particular from this episode that stood out to me, and that's the level crossing one with the house beside it. That's very nice. But aside from that, what has this episode got? Nothing. There's nothing there. I mean, it's a very good contender for 26th place, but I feel like Thomas and the Guard is just that much more shit. Okay, so this is an episode that nobody saw coming. I like this episode a lot because it's so direct and forward, and there's no annoying characters or uninteresting scenes. It does take a while to get to the really good bit, but every scene beforehand is necessary to the plot, and I can respect that. I've heard arguments that Dirty Objects does the runaway scene better, but that's why it's higher up. Also, just because a person does something better than another doesn't mean that second person's thing isn't good at all. It deserves its spot rightfully here in my eyes.
Okay, so I understand you might be thinking I'm insane, right? I mean, why would we want to watch this when The Adventure Begins does this episode so much better? Well, for me, Season 1 is a season that bathes in realism, despite being a TV show about talking trains. So Thomas isn't going to do some dramatic action chase to try and save James, but what he will do is act responsibly, and in the face of danger, be sensible. That's why I always love Season 1 over The Adventure Begins. The realism is lost in that film. I still like it, but I think Thomas and the Breakdown Train is the perfect arc finisher for Thomas. The new childlike engine who finally learns how to be responsible and helps an engine out because of it.
I don't really know what it is with this episode, but it's just so tricky to sit through. James and the Coaches is made up from 2 Audrey stories, James and the Top Hat and James and the Bootlace. And it really feels like the first story takes up way too much of this episode, and James and the Bootlace is just shoved aside. And I don't really like this balance, because I feel like James and the Top Hat is the worst story out of the 2, and I think more time should have been spent on James and the Bootlace because it's a more interesting story. I think the balance is just not in my favour, per se. James proving himself in a season so full of him being a dick. Of course I'm going to like this one. It's nothing major, but I like the arc James goes through with this episode. It starts with James being the most disliked engine and ends with him being a hero character. Amazing, simply and truly. However, it was shy from the upper half of this list for one reason. The others are more entertaining, and thus this leads me to...
Boy oh boy, did I not expect to see this so high. James and the Express really gives you that final nail in the coffin that James is here to stay. Troublesome Truck showed him to be reliable, sure, but this proves James can make friends, do right by the passengers, and be really useful after all. The episode also gives more character to Gordon by making him accept shunting, something later disregarded, but it's still fun to see some momentary progress.
Of course this was going to be fucking air. It's boring, it's lackluster, it's very much challenging to sit through. My main problem with this episode is the fact that the guard's incident, him falling over this old lady's umbrella, has nothing to do with Thomas. It's all blamed on this old woman. The fuck? The way you should be writing Thomas is that he does something bad, or something bad happens to him, and he apologises for all that shit. So why doesn't this episode do that? It's really really bad in the moral regard and the story regard. There's nothing really there substance-wise, and no other episode in this series, I'm glad to say, does this shit. Let's just move on. Another infamous episode that's a bit overrated, Thomas Goes Fishing, is another one I don't mind. It's one I respect more than I like, but I feel like there should have been more done with this idea. The plot just feels so unfinished, and it is really weird. I don't know. It's a fine episode. I just feel weird watching something that feels as first draft as this does. Number 5, Thomas Terrence in the Snow. Yeah, I may have gone a bit overboard with Thomas Terrence in the Snow last time. I still love it, that much is true, but there's better out there in season 1. This takes place in autumn and winter, both seasons presented beautifully in the sets, and we meet Terrence, a reliable, happy little orange tractor, and he proves his worth to an unconvinced Thomas who is stuck in a snowdrift after crashing into it. Every scene is important to the story, unlike some other episodes. Thomas meeting Terrence, the snowplow fiasco, the climax. I think this is a great winter episode overall for many other reasons, but since we're getting close to the top 3, I'll move on. Wow. Thomas and Bertie took me by surprise. I think the best thing that the episode does is have a balance between narration and action. The action doesn't go on for too long, and the narrator doesn't speak too much as the episode picks up, which is great. It's a wild ride and leaves you on the edge of your seat, even when you know Thomas wins, because it's a lot of fun. They should have made this a ride at Drayton Manor's Thomas Land or something, because it's such a good episode. Bertie's also excellently written and a great character that unfortunately later becomes one-dimensional. Thomas and Bertie is fun, exciting, and just a real good episode in general.
One part good, the other part tenders. I love the James segment of this episode. He makes it. The Gordon part, though, is okay. It's nothing too interesting. It more or less sets up the bit where James is on the turntable fucking spinning around, but it just feels so drawn out for no reason. Like, geez, can we just get to the fun parts, for fuck's sake?
Well, speak of the devil, this episode is confusing. The way I understood it, the engines went on strike because there's no shunter, to which the Topham Hatt gave the engines Percy, but then they bullied Edward, so they got shut up in the shed regardless. I don't see the point of having both situations here. I mean, either way, Percy is what makes this episode, and that's why it's higher up than the rest. So, yeah, deal with it. He's one entertaining engine, I'll tell you. Number 23, Percy runs away. You little bastards thought I was going to be that much more lenient against this episode? Fuck no, it's still half shit. The runaway is alright, I've seen better. I think it's just half shit, and it's half full of all this tender engine stuff that I don't really care about. It's just sort of cleaning up the mess they made in Trouble in the Shed. It's just sort of tidying up that shit before it moves on to this runaway that ultimately means nothing really. It's all born out of miscommunication and just shit. And I've sort of gotten over what Gordon says at the end with the stopping the accident thing. I'll go over that now, but it's just, I feel like there's bigger problems than that with this episode, so that's why it's down here.
Number 9, Cole. Oh, Cole. Despite that one goof where Henry leaves the station on accident, and how void you are of being funny or aesthetically pleasing, or having a giant mega crash, you are worth the 5 minutes. Nothing is as sweet as Cole in this season, maybe aside from one episode. However, we'll get to that one. Cole has Henry overcome his illness and become a really useful engine. The one problem is this episode having it a couple episodes previous to the one where he goes on strike really does throw a spanner into the works, because one moment you dislike him and then suddenly you feel bad for the guy. It creates conflicts and makes Henry all the better of a character, actually. Do I even need to explain why I put this in first? It's the Flying Fucking Kipper, a journey at a frosty dawn that ends with Henry crashing into a brake van. It's a beautiful journey that goes from peace to disaster within 2 minutes. We also get Henry's major repair and him being fixed properly, which is great for his character. For at least a while. Do I need to carry on? There must be 100 reasons this episode is so worshipped, but we all know the main ones. This is an undisputed fact within the fandom.
My problem with this episode isn't the story or anything like that. My problem lies with the fact that this is 2 railway series stories made into one. Let me explain. The flow between these 2 stories is so weak, and it's a problem I can't overlook, like a weird line or a goof. It shifts the whole episode's pace, and I don't like it. The one thing James and the coach did well was it flowed between episodes. This is horrible at it. However, I do find the 2 stories at least some parts amusing, so that's why it's not further down the list.
This is gold dust. Fucking gold dust. Within the short span of 5 minutes, we meet Toby, learn about him, receive a short little cameo from the Fat Controller, have his line closed down, and leave the episode on a hopeful cliffhanger. What the fuck? How is it this good? Something I'm really impressed by is how much we care about this little steam tram by the end of the episode. Another thing is, all the new sets for Toby's Railway are ones later used even in season 3, and I can see why, because they're so beautiful. Toby and the Stout Gentleman is a lore unto itself, and an episode I'm proud to have in my top 3.
I love how this episode brings Toby to the railway and deals with the often overlooked legal side of these episodes. Like in season 5, there's a giant flood. Where's the fire service for this shit? However, the quality of this episode dips after like the first half, and even when Toby arrives, I'm sort of bored. So as much as I'm thrilled by the concept, execution wise, I don't like this one.
Dirty Objects is a very well made episode, from the character interaction to the runaway and crash to the beautifully written karma of it all. James and Toby are two characters that have great interaction, both thinking the other is silly and untrustworthy for their own reasons, so pairing them makes for a great episode. The runaway and crash are superb, the themes making it more intense as James rushes down Gordon's hill. The crash, despite being pretty tame compared to later episodes, is still amazing for season 1, and James being covered in tar is great karma. Dirty Objects is a great 5-minute watch, and it will leave you wanting more.
Off the Rails is your quintessential Gordon episode, featuring arrogance and the like. This arrogance causes Gordon to slither into a ditch, and despite Gordon's attitude, I find it pretty entertaining, especially when you know that this accident is coming and then it will be prime and perfect karma. I definitely overrated it in my previous video, but I still think it deserves to be on the upper end of the list. Let's see how many people I can aggravate with this opinion. Down the Mine is fine, and I really do think it's a bit overrated. The plot is very simple. It gives us some nice character interaction and some banter between Thomas and Gordon. The ground caving in on Thomas is fun. You know, the whole crash bit, that's fine. I think the main problem is the mine just wasn't introduced early enough in the episode, so it just feels like it's there for the sake of it. The gimmick is one that is infamous and it keeps being referred back to, and if we got earlier episodes with this said mine, I think I'd like it more, but it's just the fact that it's just there, just convenience. You know, it's plot convenience. This episode rocks. I really do love it. One thing most of the Christmas episodes in Thomas and Friends do well is really bring everyone together and gets you, the viewer, to reflect on the season by showing some previous characters that have come to fruition. Percy, Toby, Terence, for example. They all appear, among others. It has its flaws. Don't get it twisted. Like Ringo Starr's really bad singing, despite being in the Beatles. And the fact that it took the Engines a whole year to truly thank Mrs. Kindly like this. Things like that. But I think this consistent feel-good sort of community spirit is so present here that it outweighs all of what is wrong with it. I love Thomas's Christmas episodes. They are so good. Thomas, Percy and the Coal marks the start of the Thomas and Percy friendship plotline that spans season 2. I'll explain more about that when we get to the other episodes that have that plotline, but apart from that, this episode is fine. It's got a really extra scene with the Hopper, which is, whilst ridiculous, it's kind of amusing. I think this is a pretty lame way to start season 2, and if any episode were to be adapted from Chris Audrey's More About Thomas the Tank Engine book, it should have been Drip Tank, not this fairly plain vanilla ice cream episode. Cows is one of those episodes that doesn't do much, but it does it well. It sticks to its simple plot and does everything faithfully, and I can enjoy that. You can also tell the budget has gone up since season 1, with more props and sets. However, I don't really have much else to say, since there's nothing that really stands out. It's probably the most average episode I'll ever find, and I like it for that reason. Nothing outwardly bad, but unfortunately there's nothing too outstanding. This episode is a great one. Whilst there is some level of worry involved with Bertie trying to get passengers onto Edward's train, it's mostly just an episode where you can sit back, relax, and watch some buses drive around for 5 minutes. I do think it takes from the Thomas and Bertie trope slightly, but I think it does Bertie well in the way that he is a dedicated bus who would do anything for the passengers, not even his passengers, Thomas's. It expands on his character quite a bit and makes steps towards him not being a one-dimensional character that's just a plot device. Love it. Save from Scrap is one of a multitude of scrap rescue episodes and the weakest in my opinion. Now, I'm not trying to say that Save from Scrap is anything as quality as Escape or Rusty to the Rescue, but they do follow the same basic synopsis of engine saves other mode of transport from the scrapyard because they're heroic and caring. But there's no real imminent threat with this one because Edward has a week to save poor Trevor. The guy could have stopped up at the fucking Maldives
for a long weekend and still have time to save his pal. Let's talk about his pal Trevor for a moment. His brush with death seems to make him value life more and any type of work, which I can appreciate, but apart from that, he seems very bland. Oh yeah, he likes kids as well, which is a bit fucking creepy. Old Iron is still the best. It has an entertaining runaway, gives great character development for both James and Edward, two of the greatest characters to grace the show. And we get some great themes. The runaway theme is a bop. Upon a rewatch, I was confused about how the children caused this whole shebang. How do you make it in there? How did they get into that harbour? Regardless, this episode is the best of season 2, and I don't think that'll be changing anytime soon. It still holds first place like a year ago. I really don't want to spend too much time repeating myself more on this episode, so I'm gonna shut up now and we can get on to the outro. A lot of new characters have shit first episodes, then they get another episode that improves my opinion of said character a lot. Duck takes charge, and then the Diesel story for Duck. Percy and Harold, and then the runaway for Harold. With Trevor though, it's the other way around. He has a sweet rescue story, and then a weak helping out story where he just moves planks of wood. It's as if the writers couldn't find a good enough reason to show Trevor is useful and just had him liking children and moving wood. This episode is definitely not the best. Not the worst by any stretch of the imagination, but not the best. It just exists. And a few of you fuckers probably like it. Some of you out there probably do, but not me. Alright, so let's continue. This episode is nothing. Again, nothing really happens, except Percy gets what's coming to him for a trick Gordon plays. That's great. I think especially the small 20-second long James segment is especially on point and really capitalises on what he's all about. That's really the highlight of the episode. There's nothing to say, really, except it's fun, nothing too heavy for a Thomas episode. Moving on. In Duck Takes Charge, Duck arrives and is quickly ridiculed by the big engines to which he bites back. The annoying part of this episode isn't the weird noises Ringo makes, nor the big engine's annoying nature, it's the fact that it's not interesting. Duck is a good character, but we just get that he waddles and he doesn't take shit much. Great. The plot isn't much better either. It's just Duck arriving and paying the big engines out, which, by the way, didn't Percy do the exact same thing when he arrived? So really this is just weakening Percy's character by turning him from a strong one into a weak one. I'm trying to be generous here, which is why I put it over Daisy, but it just seems the new character episodes are very weak in this season. Some people may disagree, but Percy and Harold was definitely a failed attempt at doing another Thomas and Bertie race episode. Why? Because it does nothing new. All it does is introduce a helicopter that will act as either a plot device or as a complete knobhead for the rest of the classic series. Percy still wins like Thomas did, and it teaches the exact same moral. Why not have Harold win and teach Percy that you can't win at everything in life? A hard to accept, unique moral that changes the whole episode's resolve without uprooting the amazing race segment. Again, pointless but iconic, so I'll give it some leeway, especially because it's still exciting and thrilling to watch. Alright, I understand what you may be thinking. What the shit? The runaway of all episodes. Yeah, why? Because it does so many things right. It may be slow starting, but it isn't any less enjoyable because of it, especially with the runaway itself, which, oh boy. It also gives a better introduction to Harold, showcasing him as heroic, as opposed to just a helicopter. I really can't fault this episode. It's just every episode after this is just way too good. Percy Takes the Plunge, despite there being no Percy's Promise before it, is a godsend of an episode. Every scene contributes to the perfectly crafted plot. And also, have you seen that harbour set? It is so beautiful. I mean, yeah, the plot does follow the same beats as Down the Mine, but we all know how I feel about that episode. And if you don't, then go back and watch my season 1 re-rank and you'll see. So I think Percy Takes the Plunge is a perfectly constructed story that brings some needed justice to Henry, no matter how small. It also teaches Percy a lesson, and it keeps its audience interested throughout its short runtime. A definite rewatch. I loved this episode straight up. There's not any part of this episode I don't like, and every single scene is great. Duck and Diesel bounce off each other really well as well. Diesel's character overall is brilliantly done. His comeuppance is perfect. and I think the introduction is a bit slow, but that's nothing I'm gonna get wound up over, especially with an episode with such well-written new characters and story. I'm moving on because we all know why this episode is good. I totally overhyped this episode last time, I admit. However, I'm still at the core belief that Dirty Work is a clear and amazing display of Diesel's deviousness. The story here is great and you really feel bad for Duck when he gets wrongfully shunned by the big engines. However, nothing complements it, which is a huge problem. There's nothing else here beside a strong story, which, don't get me wrong, I do put story first, and I have been doing since, and that's why I'm doing all of this in the first place. I felt that my original rankings didn't take into account story enough. Because when you have episodes like Percy Takes the Plunge and Ghost Train, which have good stories and other notable, amazing things about them, Dirty Work just kind of pales in comparison. Sorry, Dirty Work. I'd put you higher if I could, but you're just not good enough. A Close Shave is Duck's sort of redeemer episode for the character, if you can call it that. The runaway is the best part, obviously, and is one of the tensest of the classic series. In the hit era, there's like one every other episode, and it gets really old, but here it's pretty solid. I think the one problem I'll always have is Diesel is discarded off screen, and so nonchalantly that it's sad. I was looking forward to a big sending away scene or something, but instead I get one throwaway line. Diesel deserved better. Besides that, it's a really good episode and one I love a lot more than I did. So yeah, this was the one season 2 episode I actually despised when watching this. This is just Thomas being a dickweed again, and Bertie's in on the fun as well. I like the Viaduct B-plot fine, and it's the best part of the episode, but after those first 10 seconds, it rapidly goes downhill. It's also tied together in a horrible way, and is just a hot mess, frankly. If I asked a fan to describe the plot of this episode, I bet you 9 times out of 10 that they couldn't answer. Do you know why that is? It's because nobody can remember what happens, and frankly nobody cares because it doesn't affect anything. There are a lot of trilogies and like 2-parters that loosely tie together in series 2, and this is not one of them, and thank fuck it's not, because it's boring as shit. Breakman is a decent episode. We have 2 well done crashes, which I both like, and we have the looming problem of who will Sir Topham Hatt send away from the railway? Obviously we know that neither gets sent off, but it's a problem to be sure. I will say this though, Donald and Douglas definitely have the best introduction episode of most of the characters in season 2, although things tended to be skipped over and rushed when it suited the runtime. Really, it should have been a completely refurbished introduction episode to the Scottish twins, complete with the lost episode of the season, The Mission Coach, but this one suits well. Mispronunciations of said word does not make for a good episode. It's a lot of back and forth between Percy going to Edward, then the big engines, then Sir Topham Hatt, then the big engines again. Like, give the little guy a break, jeez. The Frosty effect does add a neat touch to the sets too, making it a bit more enjoyable. All this episode does though is confirm Donald and Douglas are staying on the railway, something already predictable. It's an episode I'm very middle of the road on. Thomas Comes to Breakfast feels like a 2-minute short as opposed to a 5-minute episode. Nothing comes to mind except Thomas crashing, and that is bad. It's bad because it makes the rest of the episode redundant, and since the crash doesn't change Thomas's personality or appearance like it does in the Railway series, this episode is practically pointless. What changes here? Nothing. His story, his learning, and his resolve is all atrocious, and all we get in return is a whiny railcar. End my suffering. I mean, what the fuck do you want me to say? Daisy is alright, don't get me wrong, it just worked better in the Railway series. It's a snail's pace episode where nothing really happens, aside from Daisy being just humorously rude, and Toby and Percy being fed up. Great. Nothing to talk about aside from that. It's barely even an introductory episode. Also, at the end of the episode, it doesn't even feel like the end. It just cuts off and then we just move on to the next one. I feel so wronged by this that it hurts. This episode has a decent story, something simple, but where this episode does well is the crash. It's one done pretty well and much better compared to Thomas Comes to Breakfast. Daisy is the one weak thing here, having no relation to the plot really, and yet is disciplined by Sir Topham Hatt for no other reason than being a bitch. Writers, this is why you don't miss out bits from your source material, because then your plot becomes confusing and your workarounds aren't cool. I think another notable thing is that the trucks are great here. They are fun, and their intentions are more about Percy intruding than being bumped, which is something very unique and different to earlier episodes. Just a little detail that I appreciated. Onwards we go. The Disease are one of the first comedic episodes to grace the franchise, but certainly not the last. Not only do we get Bill and Ben, but we get the fan favourite Boko, who I myself cannot find for the life of me why people like him. He is nothing, he's no one. But what is there to get excited over? Regardless, the episode is consistently decent right the way through until the scene where our twins meet the Diesel. Then it gets really good. The twins fucking with Boko is great, and I think the wordplay is also pretty good. It's unfortunate though that in the future the twins get really shafted. Wrong Road is an episode that gives another chance for Bill and Ben to shine, two characters I'm actually very fond of. Gordon is funny here, but how many Gordon episodes have we had that are like this, where he gets paid out? Too many. The episode's dialogue heavy, and there's not a lot of moving around or scenes where engines are doing things in comparison to other season 2 episodes. We see about 3 places in this episode, and like with the sad story of Henry, it gets boring because of that. Unfortunate, but it was never my cup of tea in the first place. Ignore my top 20 list. This episode is great, amazingly so, but it's not the best of the season by any means. I love all of the same things about it from before, but there's one minuscule problem I have with this episode. The Bill and Ben scenes serve no purpose for the episode. I'm not blaming Britt or the production team for this decision, because it's something Audrey wrote into his writings into that book, and it's something I don't personally think fits into this episode about Edward. It's as if we follow the tourists instead of Edward, and that's not helping the episode, especially when we have so few episodes that focus on Edward in the first place. In a season full of episodes where Edward has to share the light, this one should just be about Edward, so why are Bill and Ben here? Besides that, it is really strong, and I still love it to bits. It's such a shame that it moved down, but the next 2 episodes are just top tier. In my first list, Ghost Train barely made it to the top half of my list. I really disagree with this now, because Ghost Train is a funny yet spooky hot mess, and I'm really here for it. When I looked at this the first time, and when I've seen people rate this, I've never seen them address the point that Ghost Train isn't trying to be Duncan gets spooked or haunted Henry. It's a comedic episode with spooky elements, not the other way around, like the aforementioned episodes. For Thomas's first Halloween episode, it did well, although I wish we could have seen more scenes with the ghost engine at the beginning. Overall though, it is pretty strong, and I can appreciate it from the newer lens that I'm perceiving it from now. This is an episode that is part of the Thomas Percy trio that make up the last 3 episodes of this season. In this episode, Percy is just tormented. He's covered in treacle, then hay is taken by the wind and is blown onto him, and it sticks. He ends up looking like a bear, and Thomas and Toby mock him for it relentlessly. It's 5 minutes of Percy just being so unfortunate, and it's kind of sad. The gimmick makes it for me though, and I really like it. The story stands strong as well. There's nothing wrong that I can really find, and that is amazing. Another Christmas episode and another banger. Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree is very good at portraying the collective and community side of Christmas, with engines helping out one another and Donald and Douglas getting a main role. I can understand that you can't include every engine in a single 5-minute story, which works to this episode's disadvantage, but I still think that the scenery and the ending with Thomas and Percy patching up their season-long feud in a couple of lines is beautiful. It gets my congrats on how it tugs at my heartstrings without doing very much. This episode is another fine one. I feel like it's very overrated though for how simple and menial it is. Don't get me wrong, it's fun at points, but I feel like it shouldn't have been adapted. Hell, the writing team had to add bits and stretch the story out to make it fit the 5-minute runtime. When you have to add a whole scene of Thomas and Percy waiting for the fire lighter, you must be asking yourself if this episode's really that worth it. Plus, Percy has way better stories that he's a part of. Let's move on to them now. Percy's Promise is the episode that solidifies Thomas and Percy's friendship, plain and simple, and we love it. There are great weather effects, suspense, and most importantly, a simple yet effective story. I also like Harold in this episode, which is something that doesn't happen often. He's actually helpful here, which I like to see. I feel like this episode was one last tribute to the Thomas and Percy saga from season 2, and I like that. Overall, a stellar, memorable icon of an episode, which is very likeable. Simple but effective is how I describe this episode. It does the James and Toby conflict well, it does its little bits of humour well, and I think the story is clear and concise. The only problem is it's not got enough specialty, and there's no gimmick or super memorable moment. For that, it goes here. However, I believe that it is pretty good, and I like it. Decent, but not too much to comment on. Wow, what an episode. When I rewatched this, I was pleasantly surprised. City of Truro looks amazing. Gordon's personality is so amusing, and the special effects are great. Like, that dome looks so good. I'd really like to see the behind the scenes of this episode, like, a lot, because, like, it's really interesting. Also, that ending such a roast, especially because we have no idea who mocked Gordon. Could have really been anyone, but I kind of hope it was Edward. All around, just an amazing episode. Donald's Duck is a fun, light-hearted episode that is really good at lifting your spirits. There's beautiful scenery, humour, and an expansion to the railway. So what's the problem here? Well, I don't care. I really don't care for Duck or Donald, and that's just because I find Douglas and Oliver more entertaining. You know, the guys that are the literal, figurative opposites of our main characters, yeah, those guys, I think they're just more entertaining. Besides that, I find this episode good, but I can't connect with this one, despite its merits. Why? Why does this exist? This episode serves no real purpose to the season and contributes practically nothing. It's a forgettable little tale with an underwhelming crash, if you can even call it that. Don't get me wrong, I think it's harmless, but that's sort of the problem. The problem is that it's kind of underwhelming, and it's just plain old boring. All in all, it serves no purpose, and I'm just gonna move on. Thomas, Percy and the Dragon is another sort of humorous, sort of spooky episode that is kind of a sequel to Ghost Train and is by far the inferior one of the two. Half of the episode is Percy acting like a little bitch, and the other is filled with some papier-mâché dragons and some cultural appropriation.
Cinders and ashes, cried Thomas.
The nighttime shots look amazing as always, but it's just not got that same entertainment value as Ghost Train had. By the way, if you think these two episodes have nothing to do with each other, Thomas mentions the events of Ghost Train in the episode. A valiant attempt, but not the best by a lot. Okay, we all know I have a problem with Diesel here. He doesn't act like himself, and he's a lot more childish and pettier, but this episode's good. I'm sorry for going against my word, but I still enjoyed this one. The crash was fun, great morals are presented, and above all, the story made sense for once. This is great, especially because it's a writer's story over an Audrey one. It almost made the top 10, and it really has surprised me. Bravo. Diesel does it again. You have impressed me. Henry's Forest is a bittersweet episode, and one coated in sadness, rebuilding, and just gives some long-lasting, beautiful character development to Henry, who is so kind and sweet in this episode. He reminds me of the Iron Giant in a weird way, but by God, the sets. The ruined forest is sad, but the beautiful and thriving woodland is so majestic. This is another episode with a superb ending that isn't as emotional as All It Sees, but one that was still able to tug at my heartstrings, and it just makes me love it all the more. Again, why? Why is Gordon so out of character in this episode? And it's hard to watch since he's in a large chunk of it. The James stuff in the second half is okay, but it's a concept repeated in later seasons. At least this episode makes me feel something though. That's more than what Thomas Gets Bumped gave me, apart from general confusion. Apart from that and the beautiful scenery, this episode is a gut-wrenching pain. This is just James being a jerk for about 5 minutes, stealing Gordon's express and tricking Thomas into believing him. What an arsehole! At least James gets what he deserves, but I still think this is very poor from the writing team. Nothing here is very entertaining, but at least it doesn't drive me insane or have no point. I can see the moral, and that's why it's here. Despite that though, I expected better, and that isn't what I got, so it's a bit disappointing. This episode is beautiful. It has great nighttime shots that make the island glisten in the moonlight, as well as the engines look amazing running at night. However, Houston, we have a problem, and that problem is the lack of story, or just a really shit one basically. Thomas and Percy are afraid that Harold will replace their post-training, as Percy has been late a few times. This is all resolved after the man who complains about the lateness apologises. This is dull, especially because the ending is wrapped up rather quickly and abruptly. It's very uncomfortable and makes little sense. The ending is not really dictated by the main characters either. How many times has Gordon been late with the express? Probably quite a few times, but it doesn't mean he's suddenly petrified of Percy stealing all of his passengers. I wish I could place this one higher because of the visual stuff, but we all know that I'm a firm believer that story comes first. Now this is my jam. Thomas is notoriously an arsehole throughout the first 7 seasons of the show, which is one thing I don't really back. However, this episode is different. This episode features Thomas being kind, sadly gullible, but happy and helpful nonetheless. And then he gets dealt a really shit hand. He also helps out some of his friends along the way, and this is just one of those all-around feel-good type episodes, which I really enjoy. Mavis is your standard introductory episode to a new character, but I like this more than the bland, dull ones from season 2 because this one has a story that firstly fits Mavis, and secondly, it is actually stimulating to my brain. In Daisy, the rail car just whines and has a tantrum before the episode just abruptly ends. Here we have a clear and concise beginning, middle and end. I'm not trying to argue that this episode is amazing because it's not that entertaining or funny. The best bit is with Diesel, and he's only there for a single scene. But what I am saying is, it's a clear improvement on introductory stories, and I like it. Wow. If Mavis was alright, this is elite. Toby's Tightrope has action, suspense, great character interaction, stellar set design and special effects. I could go on. This episode also serves as the learning curve for Mavis, showing that actions sometimes have disastrous consequences, and it's why she's so tame and domestic. For the rest of the show, nothing is bad here and the story is excellent if you couldn't tell already. I will put this higher, but these next entries are so good, so let's move on to them now. This episode is one a lot of people don't really care for, which I'm not sure I can agree with. The episode focuses on our more lesser used characters, Edward, Trevor, Terence, among others, but the story is bland and it's very one note. I like that a good portion of this episode is exclusively road vehicle characters, but the problem is that they don't do anything with them besides show Bertie up a bit. This episode should have really been called A Happy Accident because I think that's what this episode is, a happy accident. Should have called All Engines Go that as well. Buzz is still just as humorous as it was a year ago. James is great, so is the stupidly animated bee that'd kill Walt Disney off if he didn't die 3 decades ago. The overall plot is good too. Boko and Trevor getting appearances is also nice. And apart from that, that's all I really have to say. It's just really good, no real problems, and quite a few positives. All at Sea is the best Duck episode ever. Now you can probably assume I don't like Duck by now, which is correct. But this episode, I must tip my hat off to it. It's a deep one and yet it's so light and cheery. Harold's kind of an ass, but that really takes a backseat to Duck's desires of wanting to explore beyond the horizon. The best bit of this episode though, is the moment it clicks for Duck that he is better off where he is. It's a great story with a great moral. Also, I can't talk about this episode without mentioning the ending. Mere words can't describe how good this ending is, so I'll just play it for you.
Duck still wonders about the lands beyond the horizon, but he enjoys being with friends most of all, and I think he knows that sometimes the best travels are those we can only dream about. Don't you?
One Good Turn suffers from the problem of twins. Twins in Thomas are an idea that are cool, like with Bill and Ben and Donald and Douglas, but they always do this plot of twins falling out, which is only done right once by my count. This isn't that time. The twins are so frustrating and seem to make up over nothing. It's just plot convenience, let's be honest here. I put it here though because it has a tiny amount of entertainment value when they aren't at odds. Every little helps, I suppose. Now, last time I ranked this way too high. The problem with this episode is that it chickens out. It's afraid to go too dark and connect Gordon and the Flying Scotsman. So what we really get in the end is just Gordon being paranoid for half the runtime, a weirdly useless Flying Scotsman cameo, and Henry getting grumpy over said cameo. The last few scenes are great and I did chuckle, but that's not enough to make me put it higher, so here it stays. Very unfortunate. Now, do not shoot me, for I can explain. Realistically, this and my number 1 pick should be tied, because I can't choose between them. However, last time I put this episode in first, and I feel as though it should be the other episode's turn in the spotlight. Escape is a wondrous adventure, like some sort of Mission Impossible or Prison Break story. Douglas has a small learning curve in this episode that doesn't really add much, but that is a B-plot to the rescue of Oliver and the underlying reality it represents. Steam engines have been a dying art for ages now. This episode helps shed light on the reality of that and gets audience intrigued by the reality of it all. But despite all of that, there is one episode that at the time of making this video and the scripts, I believe is better. Oliver Owns Up is not as good as I made out to be before, I'm prefacing that now. The story is great and so is Oliver, but we get much better stories with him, and there's much better in season 3 in my opinion. Oliver Owns Up's story is simple. Oliver gets a big head from the other engines and overestimates his own abilities, causing a crash. He learns a lesson, yay. The crash is inventive as well, and Oliver's character is heavily entertaining, although sometimes annoying. This episode gives a moral that works more for everyone. Don't get a big head, overpraise, or don't give so much praise that it gives someone a big head. I like it, but I just think that the following episodes are better. Bulgy is a character I love. He's a stubborn vehicleist, if that is a word, and very stupid. Pairing him with characters like Duck and Oliver work, and I do like Bulgy's comeuppance and how he's left beside the tracks to rust, even if it is very kind of dark. Although I must ask, who lives in the house he's left beside? Is it the driver or some random farmer? Why would you agree to having a giant bus on your lawn? Besides those minor questions, this episode is very enjoyable. A great one, to be sure. What a double-decker dude. Going right in the middle of this list is Heroes. I think most people can understand why. There are a lot of great special effects, it has great entertainment value, and it develops upon Bill and Ben's characters. However, the story is average at best, and it makes no sense. Bill and Ben are fooled by trucks, and then rescue people when the clay pits collapse, proving they're heroes. Does nobody else see the problem? There's no resolution to the actual problem created. Bill and Ben being tricked is the problem, so the resolution should be about either getting their own back, or learning not to be so gullible. I do love the second half of this episode, but a major rework of the story is needed. This is what I mean when I call episodes having a first draft story. This is a great example of what I mean. The ending's fun, and so is Percy's crash. Outside of that, nothing really stands out to me here. There's just this running gimmick of jam and the different kinds, which is fine, besides from it being rather ham-fisted. James's segment isn't that interesting either, and that's about half of the episode. So I'll place it here. That's all I really have to say. This episode is a harmless little flea. A nice flea, but it still has its problems. Notice how all the Christmas episodes so far have been in 8th. I kind of did that on purpose. Thomas and Percy's Christmas adventure does an amazing thing through the villagers giving back to the engines. It's not something really done, and that's what makes the episode all the more magical. The snow and the sets are used greatly too. The waterfall and the small village are really and just attractive as well. The story itself is sweet too, but I think the Christmas theme and the magic it brings makes it deserve its spot here. Grandpuff is undeniably a great classic telling the story of a railway lost to time and nature. Duke, Stuart and Vulcan bounce off each other beautifully, and whilst I think the story of Smudger was a bit rushed and to the point, this is a 5-minute episode we're talking about. I can understand. By the end, when the railway closes and Duke is shut up in the shed, I can't help but feel sad, and I assume most of you, if not all of you, feel the same. A nice touch to this episode is it's a story in a story, Thomas telling the other engines about Duke's story. I would have preferred Edward be the one that does this, but it makes the world feel lived in and the characters real. It's the little things like that that make this episode beautiful and a masterpiece. Okay, I know a lot of people give this episode shit for not living up to Grandpuff's magical essence, and for the recap. To be fair, the recap is a bit out there, but you have to remember this is a story of a story, and on Sodor and in the real world, there's been a passage of time, so this is necessary for the first story layer, and possibly the audience too. However, the search montage that takes place is a bit of this episode I find really interesting, as well as the scene that shows all of these maps that must have taken ages to draw. Well done, prop guys. This all leads to a tubby dude falling through Duke's shed roof, and the search team finding their sleeping beauty. The episode then ends with a somber yet heartfelt interaction between Duke and his now found friends, Sir Handel and Peter Sam, before Duke goes to sleep and then just disappears from the series altogether. Great, but seriously, I think this episode still holds some magic to it, and that ending seriously contributes a fair portion to that. Bulldog just barely misses out on the top 10, but is still a valiant episode, describing Falcon's first day pulling a train. He's still an arsehole as he's in his prime, but the pairing with the no-nonsense Duke creates great conflict and makes the crash, and in turn the resolution, that much better. I think the thing that weakens it the most are these sort of unnecessary scenes where the engines are just arguing as they puff along the tracks. I would have liked to have Falcon and Duke interact more, maybe at a station or something, so that these beautiful shots aren't as interrupted. Besides that, it is a really fun episode. You Can't Win is just a ball. It takes place on Duke's old line, so it has some magic to it, and is a simple story done well, with narration that I find frankly hilarious. I'll put in some lines now.
Poor old Grandpuff, what a shame you've broken down. Peep, peep, pip, teased Stuart. This is the day. Fancy me rescuing Grandpuff. This is the day, this is the day, he boasted. Poor old engine, poor old engine.
Regardless, I know it's like Time for Trouble, but it gives us a great insight into how well these characters bounce off one another, and how just because Duke's old, he's not above pulling a joke. This all leads to one of my favourite endings I'll put here.
What happened? Asked the boy. They don't usually need two engines. Well, replied his father, Stuart broke down. Duke had to help him. Sounds as if he had a hard job too. Duke and his driver's joke had worked. Fiddlesticks! Exclaimed Stuart, and he vanished in a cloud of steam. Duke wheezed alongside. Poor old engine, he teased. It's no good, Stuart. You can't win.
Four Little Engines sets up our main characters well, even if Reranked isn't around, and is quite an adventure. It's a story I could see being made into a full feature-length film if the writers tried hard enough. Scarlowy pulling through with a pop spring just goes to show how dedicated he is, especially because he never had to get those passengers home. His driver did say they could have just gotten the bus, but no, Scarlowy sticks it out for the good of his railway and braves the journey. This gives us a very sweet ending, especially in George Carlin's dub, where the driver praises Scarlowy and tells him he will be mended. So satisfying and worthy of being in my top 5.
Old engines can't pull trains like the young ones can. They can if they're mended, Old Faithful, smiled his driver. And that's what's going to happen to you. You deserve it.
Okay, I know this looks kind of hypocritical since I did put Passengers and Polish in 25th, and this episode kind of follows the same beats. But do you know what this episode doesn't do? Have a protagonist that leaves passengers stuck on a fucking viaduct. The main difference between Passengers and Polish and A Bad Day for Sir Handel is that A Bad Day for Sir Handel hasn't got Sir Handel's conceit negatively affecting others as much as it does himself. I mean, yeah, he's still a colossal twat bag, but at least I can draw some humour out of this because Sir Handel still cares at least a little bit. Now, I understand that most people will say that this episode is too boring and too simple and just not interesting enough. Yes, this episode isn't lore heavy or a major event that occurs, but I'll tell you what I find it to be: immersive. This episode is one that you can just get lost in for a while and enjoy the simplicity and go with the little obstacles Peter Sam faces when he pulls a passenger train. It's just all so great just to lose yourself in this for a while and watch an episode of a train accidentally leaving the refreshment lady behind. It's something more realistic than leaving your whole train behind. That's why this one is here. Trucks is fun and barely beats Bulldog. I'll probably swap them over next week, but regardless, for now I have it here. Trucks has a decent story and is one I prefer the characters and the action to. Sir Handel fakes being sick and Peter Sam has to do his jobs, inadvertently putting himself in harm's way in the process. It's great and simple, but I would have liked to see more of Rusty. For one of the first episodes he's in, it feels like he takes a back burner and is shoved to just some scenes with Harold, which shift the episode's tone and take away from its focus. But they are fun scenes. Every scene here has some kind of purpose and every character is fun. Just overall a great episode with an amazing crash. Rock and Roll is a more fun episode and the first of many Rusty is right, Duncan is wrong narrow gauge episodes in the classic series. I think it's done well and the story is simple but effective. I also like Rusty here as he's very relatable when he refuses to help Duncan after he hears what happened. It's something that many of us tend to do in real life, but Scarlowy's words push the narrative forward and build upon Rusty's character. The major problem for me here is there is no climax. I felt this should have had more serious consequences than derailment, as the rock and roll gimmick is never done again. Nevertheless, the episode is strong and the ending is really sweet. Home at Last is a simple episode that clarifies Scarlowy's return to the railway and does nothing else much. We get Duncan stuck in a tunnel because of his own rock and rolling, which is a setup for an entire episode later, and Scarlowy rescues him. Cool. Since we have no time with Duncan before this, I don't really care about him, and all we see of him is his nastiness anyway, so just turn him into a generator already. The only reason I put this one above the others is because of Rusty and the way it sets up rock and roll. Nothing much else besides that. special funnel is beautiful. It's beautiful to listen to, it's beautiful to look at, it's beautiful to get lost in. Because that's what this episode does. It gets you immersed and lost in its world, which is commendable. The sets are brilliant, the writing is tremendous, and the whole gimmick of Peter Sam losing his funnel and having it replaced with a drain pipe is funnier. Funnier still when Sir Handel mocks him over it with some cheery little rhyme. However, in the end, Peter Sam gets a better funnel which improves his capabilities and gets the other engines jealous. Just what I like to see from my mascot. Steamroller's gone up in my estimations since last time. I think the main reason is because of the fact there is no protagonist. There is no hero character that's going to prove the bad guy wrong. There is no clear right side to lean towards. Sir Handel is arrogant, George is narrow-minded, so pairing them off is a genius idea. I think the climax though is kind of shitty and a bit too long for my liking, but oh lord do I love it all the same. Again, the ending of children mocking Sir Handel for his wheels and the racing of a steamroller is quite amusing. Definitely a classic tale with nothing confusing or over the top, just pure sweet Thomas the Tank Engine and friends. The TLDR line of this episode is Duncan is a colossal arsehole for 5 minutes. Yeah, this one isn't great. I get what this story is striving to do, but it just doesn't work. I think when Duncan's complaining to himself and things are happening to him, the humour arises, but when it affects other characters, it's just frustrating. A more focused episode on Duncan would have been funnier, but this is what we're stuck with. Duncan being rude for no reason other than an attempt at humour, which failed massively. Gallant Old Engine is one of your engine gets stuck in a dire situation and pulls through episodes. It's grand, emotional, and every sort of amazing you could wish for. Duncan learning from the story is kind of in my opinion. We never really see a fallout from that, but it's alright all the same, showing the effect that morals the story presents has. I think Renee's here is great, and you could even say gallant. I think it's up there with the greats, and I guess I should move on. There's not much else I can comment on that others haven't already. Rusty to the Rescue follows the same basic concept as Escape and Save from Scrap before it, with some plot changes to fit the fact that Rusty is the one doing the saving, and to introduce the Stepney saga. There's some beautiful shots, sets and interaction here, with some of the most amazing music I've heard out of all of the seasons. However, as much as they try to pull it off, there's no risk here, or at least it doesn't feel that way. There are some diesels that tell Rusty to stop, but don't do anything, so all in all, this felt too easy and there wasn't any suspense for what should have been a very suspenseful episode. This episode is shit, plain and simple. Nothing is that likeable apart from Stepney, who is relentlessly insulted and shunned by Thomas, who is the worst part of this episode. Thomas is a dick here. The story is very dull, and it's just so boring. Stepney has charm, and his ability to win Thomas over is amazing, but that doesn't happen until like the last minute, which is disappointing. Stepney has a lot of good episodes here, but this is not one of them. One of Stepney's better episodes, Train Stops Play, is a wild ride. The characters of Stepney and Caroline bounce off each other well, despite the Bertie Chase type plot, and all of that makes for an amusing, heartwarming ending where Caroline gets to finally rest and watch the cricket game. Again, the plot is simple and really low stakes. I'd understand if it was some signed ball or one that's really rare, but can't they just buy another one from a shop nearby? If not, why only bring one ball to a cricket game? Surely as a bunch of cricketers, you'd think to bring multiple. So this whole episode is built upon convenience and coincidence, which is kind of disappointing, but nevertheless, it's still a fun episode. Bowled Out is an episode with a really good villain, one that takes pity upon the engines and acts like they're all old. That's a well done antagonist right there. The story itself is fun as well, having Bowler, as the Diesel's affectionately called, break down and Stepney save the day. Next day, both go back to where they came from, with Stepney leaving with a huge send-off. Bowler, on the other hand, leaves in secret. The ending is great in this respect, showcasing that steam is still respected on this island and Diesel will never override them. This has been done before, but this is a new extreme as Bowler tries to take the Express, essentially threatening every engine's position on the island. But it fails and the engines keep their rails. Such a good story. What is with Henry and that tunnel? First he gets bricked up in it and then he finds an elephant in it, I swear to God. Anyway, Henry and the elephant is another weird choice. Why? considering the strike plot from season 1 ended back then, this adds nothing. At the end I was questioning what I could take away from this. Nevertheless, I feel the circus plot is good. Though brushed over, I would have loved an episode that focuses more on that. We did in season 8, but that episode's shit. The elephant also looks well made and there is some humour with it. It's a light, fun episode with some questionable decisions behind it. Paint Pots and Queens is what I call a special kind of episode. Why? Because it does the stupid thing of attempting to go back to season 1 continuity all the way in season 4. Really? Other than that, it's only meh. It wraps up stuff forgotten about and the ending is quite sweet, but other than that, I don't really see the point of this episode even existing. This is especially true due to the fact that the story revolves around Queen Elizabeth II, someone who was there for all of 20 seconds. Great, let's move on. This whole episode is just meh. It falls flat for me because there is no real story here. The engines get to go and meet their fans in the lamest meet and greet ever, but Thomas gets cocky and crashes. Will he be repaired in time? We all know he will. We all know he will. He's Thomas the Tank Engine. No real consequence befalls him ever. And when we get to the place, wherever it is, we spend all of 10 seconds there. Great. So we get no fun reward for sitting through a total red herring of a story. At least the story makes sense and I can actually sit through this one barely. What can I say about Bullseyes? An amusing, light-hearted episode that has frankly a great theme that reminds me of something from Spain, which I'm assuming is the idea. Daisy and Toby have great interaction and make use of his seemingly neglected cow catchers for the first time since season 1. The plot is fairly simple. Daisy slags Toby off and later has to move a bull out of the way, which she can't do, so Toby helps and Daisy is proven wrong. The ending is also amusing, having Daisy belittled by school children. Overall, a very amusing and simple episode, and that simplicity works in its favour. Toad Stands By is an episode I was surprised by how good it was. There's a bit of time confusion, as this is an episode that's a season apart from when it was supposed to be. Scruffy's an excellent villain as well, being one of the only rolling stock antagonists. The way he mocks Oliver despite being so physically weak just demonstrates how much power he has, and I love it. There are a few dialogue scenes to sit through before we get to the amazing climax where Scruffy gets ripped apart, which is brilliant by the way, as well as this Pop Goes the Diesel rip-off song, which already ripped off another rhyme. It was a rip-off of a rip-off. Great. But at the end of the day, the story stands up well, and the characters do too. And that's all I can really ask for. Anything else is a bonus. Fish is just the flying kipper again, and if you don't think that, please tell me why. Both involve crashes caused by a blameless fault onto Henry and his fish train, both happen at night and both end at dawn. It's just trying too hard to do the same thing that made the flying kipper so magical, and it really shows. Again, we could have had so many other Chris Audrey stories that work, but this really special attraction makes absolutely no sense. The two stories that make it up are loosely and lazily connected, and it's just here to pad out the runtime. The writers could have done very interesting stories that aren't either of the ones here, and they would have just been so much better. Drip Tank, Triple Header, Scrambled Eggs, many others. Also, can I just mention Bullstrode is literally just Bulgy, but without the wheels, the creativity, or the redemption arc. So just another boring supremacist villain with a slightly amusing comeuppance. Great. Flying that bike is so pointless as well. You meet some Postman Pat ripoff called Tom, who gets his van taken away and has to ride a bike. Percy accidentally destroys said bike, so Tom gets his van back. Great. Both have great openings though. The harbour with fish, the shots of Tom driving around Sodor in Mind That Bike. Both beautiful visuals paired with great music. What a great second half to an episode. Such a thrilling way to kick off season 5. It's very clear at least a good chunk of the budget was put into that. The first half's a bit bland and duller, but the setup is required to give us the storm scene, an excellent way to make an episode stand out. Nothing like anything in a season prior. Cranky's also a really interesting character too. Having a crane be a character is amazing, and all the directions you could take it aren't explored in season 5 but are done so later, just showing that his very good character was enough to make him stick. What a lad. Horrid Lorry is a vastly entertaining episode with 3 incredible one-off villains in the lorries. They all meet their fate in interesting fun crashes that show themselves up to be idiotic after they say the engines are out of date. Toby's role in this episode is also both important and interesting as he watches the lorries make fool of themselves, along with the miller shunning the tram for the more modern lorries. All of this makes for a very interesting moral that delves into the deeper parts of Audrey's writings, except the lorries are taking the place of trains instead of diesels taking the place of of steamies. It's very meticulous and clever in that sense. An episode that has an amazing crash, but the story lacks. That's a better view for Gordon in a nutshell. What even is this story? It's so insignificant and weird compared to the memorability of the crash, which is based off a real one in London's King Cross station. This episode really feels like one where the crew had to make a story and do everything around this crash, and it's really sad. I feel like with better writing, this could have been really fun. The crash and the special effects is great, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to give it 10 out of 10 because of that. What's a fun, unique episode that includes minor characters to give more development and slide some humour on the side? Having the Fat Controller as a lead character is such a good decision for this funnier episode, and giving characters like George and Caroline the limelight, even just for 30 seconds. This all adds up in the Fat Controller messing up his new suit, but especially for his wife's birthday. The ending perfects the episode beautifully, with his wife finding Sir Topham's state amusing and the party doors closing as the guests all partake in the buffet on the table. The tree falling over is fun and James is perfectly in character. That's about it. The episode does nothing wrong, but there's just something about it that I can't enjoy too much. Maybe it's Thomas. He's sort of shoehorned into the back end of the episode a bit and comes in as this saviour incarnate. Thomas, let's get real for a minute. You don't need to prove your excellence. The show's named after you. Your face is on the DVDs, toy packagings and lunchboxes. There's no need to be here. Get Edward in on this season. Have him help James instead. Those two have way better chemistry and will improve the episode, in my opinion. Let's be real, no one expected this to get high up on the list, and for good reasons. This is another episode with multiple stories happening that are interweaved very poorly. Everything is so whatever, from the Gordon stuff to the dog thing and a bit about the gremlins. There's this one funny scene with Dowager Hat in the bathtub getting shaken around, but mainly it's all too fuzzy and hazy for me, and it's just at best. Moving on. George is a great character that has an amazing final story where he's just as rude and intolerable as ever. This time taking out his distaste on the steamies towards the standard gauge. Although this story feels very much like the engines deal with George's shit and then the Fat Controller finds out, as opposed to driving the plot in some way. It's bad conclusively, but the crashes and everything else is a thrilling ride. Bar is another sort of mediocre, light-hearted episode that I don't mind, but in the grand scheme of the season is pretty piss poor. It's all just nice. There are no dramatic special effects, funny dialogue besides that one bit where Sir Topham's hat says he'll eat his hat, and no amazing plot. Nothing makes this episode stand out, so it's really just left for dust in the background, taking up space in a season so grand. A decent story, great set design and compelling characters. What does this episode not have? Well, morals. I don't get what this episode is trying to teach, and that's why it didn't make the top 10. It really is confusing, and therefore the episode sort of doesn't have a basis for its creation other than its mesmerising visuals. The mind collapse and climax as a whole is really effective though, and is very compelling. But wait, is that Scruffy there stuck in that mind? Did the crew just make an in-joke where they brought Scruffy back just to kill him? See, that's the amazing thing about Season 5. Everywhere you turn, there are more fun details to explore. Talk about making an impression. Wow. Again, another episode that could have easily made it to theatres as an hour-long special. Somebody call The Rock for this disaster film. Okay, enough pretensing. Toby and the Flood is amazing with set design, music and special effects. The only part that is less than amazing is the direction the story takes. We already have an episode of an engine's life being threatened that I haven't spoken about yet. I think Toby should have been a more heroic character in this and managed to warn the townspeople of the flood and get everyone to safety before the dam breaks. I think it's because Percy was the real hero here, and yet when the end arrives and everyone's happy for Toby, no one really praises Percy apart from a mere mention. It's a bit sad. This type of episode belongs in Scooby-Doo, not Thomas the Tank Engine. There's a lot of atmosphere brought to life by the sets, music and narration by either Alec Baldwin or Michael Angelis. Both do superbly narrating not just this episode but throughout all of the season. I also find the cute little fact that the station master looks like George Carlin. It's nothing major, but it's those little things that bring new life to the episode and make it that much more special. The ending is what I find to be the most enjoyable though. Having a new station built for the station master and all of the mysteries of the episode solved. This is an episode that I gave a lot of slack for not living to my expectations previously. Now I think it's alright. It's not amazing or anything, but I don't think it deserves last place. Derek is a new character that has a fun gimmick, but aside from that, no one knows who this bloke is. Bill and Ben are the undisputed best part of this episode, despite being not that funny. The plot's okay and it's pretty basic and something I don't find that funny, but all in all, it's alright. How did I not put this at number 1 before? It's dark, it's horrific, and it's eerie. However, the magic of all of this is that you wouldn't be able to tell that from the first minute. The first bit of the episode is normal and nothing spooky, with Stepney just working at the quarry. Then suddenly on the way back, Stepney loses his way and finds his way into a spookier setting of a scrapyard. The tonal shift done here is beautiful, from the bustling, busy quarry where his friends are to the scrapyard, an essential locomotive cemetery. Also, there's the small detail that Stepney almost dies. This is due to Ari and Bert, considered to be the scariest villains in the show, by many including me. They're completely ruined later on, but for now they're great. The way this episode caps off is excellent too, with Stepney freed and able to get back home. There's no punishment for our villains, but it isn't really too necessary as we're too busy appreciating Stepney not being dead. One final thing, Alec Baldwin in this episode is amazing. Way better than Angelus. Here are a few lines he does really well.
"Thank you, sir," said Stepney. "Shall I be away long?" "I will, and thank you for a lovely day." Then they approached an unknown area. The Diesels took him to the large smelter shed. "Yes, sir, but I have learned something." "What's that?" "There's no place like home. Bluebells forever."
This base concept is fun, of Toby discovering a lost part of Sodal that's been rotted away by time. Why it's done twice is weird and probably not that necessary, but I'm very glad that they decided to do both, because the castle set is decent and that mine is amazing. The only confusing part of this episode is the existence of Bertram and why he was made a character only to never be seen again. Just make an episode about him, just one, goddammit, we need it for our souls. Something in the Air is a fun, nothing too heavy episode with a great crash. And Henry has some fun episodes this season, this being one of them. I don't like how he's a dick to Thomas, having no reason not to believe his warnings, but that does give us Henry spitting out water in one of the coolest special effect moments of the season, and maybe the franchise so far. Thomas complaining about fish is also an earache to sit through. Just man up, boy. I get it reeks, but then again, so did Henry after falling into the ocean, and you gave us a nice ending instead of whining. Thomas, Percy and Old Slow Coach is another one of those episodes that has multiple small storylines that aren't done very well. The only difference is the satisfying ending present, and James's scenes are pretty well fleshed out in comparison to the rest of the episode. I find the resolve of this episode, Old Slow Coach becoming a workman's hut, not very interesting, but at least they had a plot that they worked on more. Season 5 is known for explosions, runaways, and just overall being a season full of adrenaline. So having an episode like this among the many fruitful plots is disappointing. Neither of these plots I care about, and both are so pointless and connect together in such a shitty way that I can't like this. The children losing their playground is such an insignificant plot that it seems like it belongs in season 10, and the engine's overthinking Harold taking a VIP just makes them all unlikable. All in all, there's little to like here, and this just isn't anywhere near close to the best this season has to offer. Oliver's Find is another that I find only alright. With Toby's Discovery being the superior Discovery episode this season, I find this one very mediocre. It takes elements from really good episodes, like the aforementioned Toby's Discovery and Stepney Gets Lost, So Top of My Hat's Holiday, and even Oliver Owns Up. I think this makes it all messy and not very fun at all, although you can still get a bit of enjoyment out of it, and we do get some fun scenes with Oliver and Harold of all characters. Yeah, I know, somehow Harold is entertaining. This episode's a fun, light-hearted one with Percy taking great leaps in kindness to get the bride's good luck package. It's rarely boring, often fun, and a very original, different concept, different to the usual stuff you see on Thomas and Friends. And guess what? Edward finally has a fucking role. Hallelujah, praise be. It's not anything prominent, but it will do. But regardless, this episode is highly entertaining and with a very sweet ending, just all around excellent. Number 25 is the Topham Hatt's Holiday. Again, this is another episode with two plots that are really weak. The Tiger Moth stuff is whatever and feels very rushed. Topham Down the Canal is a bit better and kind of funny, but overall this episode is just light-hearted hijinks. And considering we already have an episode about Sir Topham this season, this is really weak. Also, there's Lady Hat being a dick to Annie and Clarabelle, which isn't the greatest. My god, there's a lot happening. I'd say too much, way too much. A Surprise for Percy has a fun runaway and a very new and interesting moral. That's about it. The moral is very ham-fisted though, and it's not as if this season's sparse in runaways and crashes. It's just a slice of life episode. Not bad, but not necessary. Very middle of the road. Not much to say apart from that, especially because Percy has another far better episode this season. Fuck you all, Make Someone Happy deserves to be here. I know it's an episode that in a season so great is sort of menial, It has a strong moral though, and in my opinion, a sweet and endearing ending that's different to any other in the classic series. James here is excellent, and the story improves upon his personality and character tremendously. If only it stuck. Mrs. Kindly getting brought back is a decision that ultimately doesn't waste as much time as I thought they would if they brought in a new character. Respectable. All around, I think this episode is underrated as hell and deserves at least a bit more notability. What a great chase sequence. Busy going backwards is truly an entertaining episode with a great theme playing in the back, which I forgot the name of, but my lord, this is great. The plot itself is also sweet, with Toad just wanting to be like the other engines who he speaks with the most. The trucks feel hurt by this, thinking he's acting above them, and cause the runaway. Perspective is what this episode does best, as every perspective you can look at this episode from. It works, and it works well. Very impressive feat. Last time I put this at number 1, so I bet you fuckers are surprised. Duncan Gets Spooked is still just as fun, eerie and magical, and I'd love it if a film was made around this story, but the bit with Peter Sam, as much as I don't want to say it, is boring. It doesn't really do well setting up anything despite being a fun runaway, and I think they could have just had Peter Sam hear noises as he crosses the bridge at night or something. That would have been a much more interesting start. All in all though, it is Duncan's definitive best episode due to all of the other aspects that make it enjoyable and such a thrilling watch. Snow is a very mediocre episode. Yes, there's a great avalanche, but then again, Scarlowy being turned into an icicle messes with the tone of the danger previously presented. Yes, there's a fun ending, but the beginning is very boring. All of these pros and cons weigh up to be a very mid-tier episode. It's fine, it exists, cool. I don't really have anything else to say. Snow is snow, and that's about it. When you're watching an episode about trains trying to deal with a runaway Indiana Jones boulder, you know you're having a good time. These little guys must have some guts to even try and evade that thing. Also explosions. This is the only time that's happened in the classic era, and it makes the episode stand out even more. All that said, the best part of the episode is the eerie ending, where the narrator doesn't outright confirm the boulder's sentience, but alludes to it as some eerie music plays in the background. Such tasty goodness. Of course this is going to be high up on the list. Salty's Secret is an iconic episode, complete with this fun, developed character that is a diesel and is nice. They completely demonstrate his wants, his desires, his allegiances and his worries within this short little episode, and it's impressive how they managed to do that. The story is a simple case of Salty wants to be by the sea and isn't, so works hard to try and gain that privilege and succeeds. This also presents a really good moral that I don't see a lot of kids shows tackle, to be fair. Working hard can get you what you want. So this episode sticks a lot more to me than it did a year ago, as I'm a kid just trying to gain some qualifications over here. Harvey's a little innocent fella and is wrongfully shunned by the engines, even Edward, which is weird because Thomas, you know, the one that has been known to stoop to the lowest level on occasion, is the one to root for him. Edward and Thomas need to do some major switcheroo here. Again, most of it is fine in your standard Thomas the Tank Engine episode. I like Harvey's design a lot, and Cranky and Salty give us a nice beginning, but overall, it's pretty average. Often when I talk about Season 6's brilliant humour, I'll be talking about this episode. No Sleep for Cranky is hilarious. The music and faces just add so much to Angelus's narration, and the way they flow with how the episode transpires is done beautifully. Usually I have a problem with staying in one location all of the time, but here I don't. Cranky is trapped with Salty, Bill and Ben, and we get to be there so we can relate more to Cranky. In the end, as his desperation wears thin. There isn't really a problem with this episode, except I just found it not as good as the others higher up. If you guys know me, you might know I despise Harold. He's this arrogant, smug-sounding pilot asshole, and is just mainly a device for rescuing the engines. He's even more arrogant in this episode when he takes the mail from Percy. The climax is alright, crashing into a pile of hay isn't the most exciting thing, but then again, Harold being a helicopter makes him limited as to what he can crash into. The ending is superb though, with Percy putting aside his rivalry to help Harold, and the pair making it up sweetly at the sheds. Season 6 has some great episode endings, and this is no exception. Although I think from now on, I won't think of this as a poor Harold episode, but rather an exceptional Percy episode. This episode is another alright one. Elizabeth is a well-written, cynical character that is done well even in the Season 8 episode she appears in, which is saying a lot. She's stubborn, a great source of humour and sarcastic. However, this episode needs a major rewrite and feels very first draft. The opening is great with Thomas's crew finding Elizabeth and them conversing. Then it becomes really dull. Elizabeth getting Thomas the parts he needs doesn't feel drawn out enough, and I think Elizabeth should have broken down or something so Thomas can help her and the pair's feud can be resolved. I have a bunch of ideas for how this episode should be improved upon, and maybe I'll make a full video either making my own version or at least explaining how this episode might work in my head. It's so unfortunate that it's so first draft because I think it could have been really good. There is some clear outstanding set design with this one which is applause-worthy. The beautiful valley, the mist, and just the sets in general are great, and not just in this episode either, despite it having some great ones. The moral here is one I can also stand by, despite it being a bit ham-fisted. However, apart from that, it's very basic. The crash, the annoying foghorn, and Percy not understanding what it is, and the concept alone is just a bit basic and dabbles in some hit error stuff that displeases me. But the ending's cute, so it's not all bad. It was an earnest attempt of an episode. Jack Jumps In is a welcome and diverse change into the series, with Thomas and the rest of the engines taking a back seat and having this new group of construction vehicles take the spotlight. Within the short runtime, what amazes me is how fleshed out and identifiable these guys are. Jack is the excited new guy ready to help out wherever he can, Oliver is the quiet giant type character, Elizabeth loves keeping her image maintained, Max is an uncaring bully, and so on and so forth. There's a nice crash here, a bit on the tamer side, but this is an introductory episode after all. There's one moment here that really sticks out for me, however, and that is the moment Max does a 360 that reveals this horrifying grin that almost makes it seem like his smile is stuck. It's creepy as shit.
Hello, children.
That's fucking creepy.
Hello, children.
A great expansion to the pack, this episode has an amazing reach into Jack's character and ties up all of the things left unconfirmed in the last episode. Jack's bravery here is great to see, and I think that some of the other pack members that didn't get as much of a chance to shine previously got that here. For instance, Ned is around this time and is shown to be a real klutz. Kelly is also demonstrated to be the natural leader of the bunch, whereas last time he was just a sensible crane. And do we even need to speak of that amazing bridge collapse? Everyone knows that's a highlight of the season. The episode also has one of those gushy, mushy, heartwarming endings that I love about season 6 and 7, and it's probably one of my favourite endings of the series because it's so beautifully done. It's Only Snow and James of the Red Balloon are both very unappealing episodes in their own right and are so level on the playing field of bad season 6 episodes that it hurts. It's Only Snow has these gorgeous snowy sets and a plot that makes sense. It's Only Snow has this recurring plot of Thomas not wanting to wear his snowplow, which is so old that it's stale. Just anything but this stupid plot, please. This one surprised me. This is definitively a better version of Buffer Bother and the best Scottish twin episode of the classic series in my opinion. Why? Because it puts conflict their way and because they're not kids. The problem with having Bill and Ben do a conflict episode like with One Good Turn or Buffer Bother is that they're childish and in the end they become ridiculously annoying. Donald and Douglas seem more stubborn and weary, so yes, it's still annoying, but the pair know when to put their feud aside because they still love each other. I never got that in Buffer Bother, sadly. The world's strongest engine brings us Diesel. In his stupidity, he tries pulling as many trucks as Henry and ends up shooting himself onto a barge, special attraction style. What I love here is the build-up. Diesel is such a force to be reckoned with, and seeing the long scene where we anticipate whether he will succeed or fail is so interesting. I'd say maybe the crash is a bit of an anticlimax, but it fits with the episode perfectly. Rounding out our top 10 is Scaredy Engines. I love the moral dilemma Percy's presented with here, to console Thomas who has been scared half to death or stay with Duck who stopped Thomas from bullying him. This is a great test for Percy as he ends up choosing the former, a better decision, which gives us a beautiful ending with some fireworks and some heartwarming feels, but the best scene of this episode is Thomas spooked by the whistle and the chains in the beautifully decorated scrapyard. The set and the story that happens here is great, funny, eerie, and just one of a multitude of reasons why I think season 6 is so underrated. This story's a load of season 8 style nonsense and the ending's barely passable, but I can actually give an episode some praise now. Yay. The set work here is pretty decent. We're talking some season 5 stuff. That building just sunk into the ground. However, the stupid gnome stuff is totally ridiculous and isn't at all humorous or entertaining. I'm not saying this episode's amazing or anything, but it has one great redeeming quality, and that's enough for me to put it here.
Well, shit, this does not prove my point. Middle Engine is atrocious, quite frankly. I think it tries to be funny and fails, that's what lets it down. The idea of an engine stuck in between two trains is amusing in concept, but since the visuals are so shit, you already know they fucked that idea up. But even then, the way it's written makes it only appeal to the lowest common denominator, infants. And then there's that one thing that everyone, including
including me, mentions when they talk about Middle Engine, the Fat Controller's an arsehole for not trusting Percy, an engine with not the best record, but I still think he should have trusted his engine.
James and the Red Balloon is more comedic and has these amazing shots of the balloon flying high in the sky, which are pretty immersive. However, the downfalls are really bad. But James and the Red Balloon has a plot that's nonsensical. How is James that stupid to think that all of his passengers will be taken by something that's so cramped just because he's red? His character is ruined. James is just a bull at this point, I think. However, I think I'm going to give this episode the edge, because the balloon peacefully drifting through the sky is amazing, especially paired with the beautiful themes Season 6 has to offer.
Scary Jack Frost, cried James.
Yeah, this one's kind of It's not outwardly bad, but it is a snore fest. There's some nice model work here, but we all know this episode exists purely so 3-year-old Timmy can get his hands on his own wooden railway Jack Frost Percy. Also, why isn't this episode about Jack? Remember Jack? The one introduced not 10 episodes ago, the Digger? Yeah, me neither. But he should have been the actual Jack Frost in this episode, instead of tricking me into thinking this episode was not going to be about Thomas, James or Percy for once. The most infamous crash of the series got a pretty decent story to tag along with it too. Everyone here is perfect. There's perfect character, perfect story, and everything just fits very snugly. I think Salty so easily forgiving Gordon at the end is such a testament as to what kind of character he is and just how genuine he is. I think this is one of these episodes where you just have to watch it to understand how good it is. Mere words cannot display the greatness of it. So after this, go and watch the feckin' thing. Thanks. I think if you've watched my content for a long time, you'll know that Percy's Chocolate Crunch is the pinnacle of nostalgia for me and my favourite episode of the entire show's history. This isn't completely nostalgia based though. I do have some good reasons as to why I believe it's so good. For instance, the use of Percy being the one that wants a washdown really breaks the stereotype that James is the only one that cares about being clean. Also, it's pretty funny. I think Percy's reactions to being made dirtier and dirtier are pretty amusing, especially with Angelus's narration. The crash and gimmick from it are pretty entertaining too, but the best part of this whole episode is that ending. We all know I love a heartwarming ending, and this is my favourite, unsurprisingly. The music, the narration, and Percy's joyful expression just fills me with so much wholesome energy it's hard not to love. Just the best. What is Bill in this episode? The writers tried developing Bill's character a bit and just ended up making him a douche. Why? His twin separation story is so boring and is done better in other seasons, this one especially, but we'll get to that one. Bill is such a sulky dickhead and it's unfunny, except for when the pipe falls into his funnel. Is that how much I hate Bill? I have to see him endure physical pain to laugh. There's plenty of funny episodes in season 6 and this ain't it, Chief. If Toby and the Flood showed Toby's bravery, this episode damn well shows Toby's determination. Toby willingly goes out into a snowstorm along his old, extremely hazardous branch line to save some lambs. What a hero. This is why Toby is such a good character. He may look old and outdated, but he's in fact a determined and caring tram that will cross the pits of hell to help someone. He even offers his own coach for the lambs to sleep in despite it being his most faithful one. What a saint. This episode does great lengths for Toby's character, but it also has great sets and special effects and a decent story with some climax and a touching resolve. One of the series' greats for definite. Oh no, it doesn't get better, does it? We all know this episode for the screaming. You know, that screaming. It has an okay moral, but again, it tries to be funny and fails for me. You know why? Because this episode is aimed at toddlers, and it definitely shows. Thomas and Percy are so blatantly appealing to 3-year-old Timmy, so much so that Gordon, you know, the other side character in this episode, is the best part. Even the ending's just okay, and in a season known for the cheesy, heartwarming endings, that is really bad. This episode needs to get back to the gutter. Thomas the Jet Engine, on the other hand, is 5 minutes of wacky, fast-paced energy that leaves you so thrilled. Thomas is to pull a jet engine which starts up when Cranky knocks it, and so Thomas flies across Sodor, passing Percy and Gordon, giving us 2 of the funniest lines in the series. I'll put them here.
Want a race, Thomas? Beat Bertie? Never mind. Hi, Gordon. Bye, Gordon.
This humbles Gordon in the process, even if it's a lesson he already learned. It's fairly obvious this episode is a bit of a stepping stone for him. The sequence maybe goes on for a bit too long, but it's still fun and entertaining regardless. So which one do I prefer? Probably Thomas the Jet Engine. It has more pros like the iconic lines and the great segments, but again, I'll probably change my mind tomorrow. When you have to resort to making a character just referred to as a back engine for his one episode this season, despite being a reliable hero that would do anything for the good of his railway, his home, you're doing something wrong. It takes a lot of
determination for Edward to be the back engine of two engines at once, for sure. But then again, did we really have to do this plot at all? Of all the episodes to copy the format from out of the previous seasons, you go and pick Edward and Gordon, not Old Iron or Edward's exploit. Even Bertie's chase was better than this, and you pick it. Why? This returning episode about Edward could have been so much more than just Edward being a really good back engine, but alas, it wasn't. Extremely cool crash aside, this episode's okay. Duncan kamikazing himself is the obvious highlight, but then there's the simple, familiar Duncan wrong, Rusty right dynamic that I'm so done with at this point. Why do they never flip this on its head and make Duncan the one in the right for once? That's something I want to see. The base concept lets this episode down for me, and it's a shame Duncan is often shown like this, no matter how amusing the crashes are, and no matter how funny moments like this make the episode funny.
Glug, 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 he said, "Bluggle my broiler." Duncan felt foolish and very wet.
I find people give this one a bit too much slack, another example of how wronged Season 6 is in general. Yes, lore-wise, it is strange and quite odd, that was until CGI narrow gauge. But as a base episode, it's a really sweet one. Rusty tries to help his friends because he knows their line is special to them. What a lad! Elizabeth is brought into the episode as well to add some flair as it began slowing down, which I think was a wise decision. She's quite sardonic in nature, which adds some humour. Can people please start leaving this one alone? It has its problems for sure, but that's no reason to start overlooking the beautiful positives it has going for it and the heartfelt message beneath the surface. I don't understand why people hate this episode just because it follows the same beats as Mike's Whistle. I do prefer this episode to Mike's Whistle for a few reasons, the first of which is that Duncan is the main character, a choice that is pretty smart as Rusty doesn't have a starring role. Yes, a Duncan episode where Duncan's foolish and Rusty's not really around, thank the Lord above. Also, the gimmick of the organ instead of the passengers yelling is a much more entertaining improvement. I'd rather have the nice toots of an organ as opposed to some screaming any day. Regardless, people need to stop shitting on this one because it's one of the few Duncan episodes where Rusty isn't paired alongside him, a much needed change to the narrow gauge. Emily's new coaches is a very decent start to Season 7. Emily is such a well-developed, interesting character who has not only a great design but a great personality as well. We see it all throughout Season 7 in episodes like What's the Matter with Henry and Salty Stormy Tale. But we aren't focusing on those right now, we're looking at this episode, and it's a great introduction to that character. It can be slow, but picks up the pace when Oliver gets stranded on a set of points. So in the face of danger, Emily proves herself to the others and the audience. It's a very good episode to analyse, what can I say? The way Sir Topham just actively disregards Percy is kinda sad. I swear there's a personal vendetta there. First Middle Engine and now here. Aside from that, this episode does decently. A harmless, charming 5 minutes with a nice enough crash and a sweet resolution. When I think of Season 7 and all of the elements that make it sweeter, this has all of them. I just believe that other episodes higher up on the list do these things better. This episode is kind of annoying. Bill and Ben are mean to my boy Fergus, who isn't the most likeable here either. There's a great scene where Fergus is crushed by falling rocks, and it really shows his brave character as he saves the China Clay twins at the cost of himself. However, when this is paired with the irritation that every main character brings, it isn't pleasant at all. I remember watching this as a kid and enjoying it a lot more than I do now, which is quite sad. Now, I'm not saying this episode is amazing or anything, but I think a lot of people give this one a hard time because of how similar Skarloey is here to Season 9 onwards. I can see what people mean, but surely Skarloey overcoming his trauma from dangling off a fucking bridge is the main takeaway, not the fact that he's a coward, right? Sure, Skarloey acts a bit childish for a few moments there, but when Reranked is in danger, Skarloey immediately drops all of that fear to rescue him, which is why this episode does so well. The bridge set also looks super unique and stands out from that ugly one in Trusty Rusty, and overall, it's really not that bad. Just because Edward is sad does not make him out of character. Why did I ever think that was reason enough to put this low down? Nevertheless, this episode has creative liberties with a fun crash and a concept that leads to what we all love to see. Edward triumphing against the odds. It's not as powerful as in Edward's exploit, but it's still present and noteworthy. But he also has a part to play here, and it's just nice to see him in a role that doesn't have to do with racing. If it weren't for Emily, this episode would be way further down. I'm not one that despises the story anymore because it represents the crew's memories with Henry, them helping to tell Henry's story of overcoming illness. Thomas and Percy are absolute twats, and I hate seeing Henry in such a state, but Emily saves this episode because she's the voice of reason and actually helps instead of being horrible. I like how meta the ending is though, as one last testament to the Green Engine's most notable arc. I think this episode is actively trying to be that, a testament, as the crew won't get to work with Henry again. Sad times indeed. I thought this one was amazing before, and I still do. James trying to stay clean, succeeding, and then subverting your expectations at the last minute is hilarious. It's a great way to stand out, and what James has to go through is just as unique, pulling a giant grimy barge barge around. The crash and build-up is pretty well done, and the way this whole episode works is just magic and very impressive. So impressive that it made the number 4 spot, once again cementing its spot as one of the best season 7 episodes in my opinion. This one is not really one that many people appreciate all that much, and that's okay, but with how chaotic and insane the season is, a slower and calm episode is much appreciated. This episode is pretty immersive for how simple it is, and it's nice to see a very different solution to Peter Sam's problem. It's very similar to Thomas Percy and Old Slow Coach in this regard, but is a lot more chill. It doesn't try to be very intense and become forgettable, a lot like Thomas Percy and Old Slow Coach. Even that storm segment isn't all that focal and is brushed over quite quickly. By the way, the narration by Angelus is beautiful, and the Cockney accent he gives to the refreshment lady is hilarious. The refreshment lady's tea shop is unique, sweet, and is very representative of our mascot. The Spotless Record brings a great new character in Arthur, who is probably the engine the writers focused on the most in season 7. Albeit for good reason, because Arthur's fucking cool. His theme is amazingly catchy and his character is so right. However, the story's kinda shit. Thomas plays a trick on Arthur for seemingly no reason. Well, there is a reason. Thomas doesn't like Arthur, but that's piss poor, causing a crash, and Thomas apologises. This is very meh. Thomas seems so unreasonable here, and I would have thought he'd stop being a total knob goblin by now. There are good scenes here and there, like when the fruit goes everywhere and that sweet ending scene. Other than that, it's kinda weak, so this isn't number 1 anymore, obviously. I think the story's still sweet, but it's wrapped up so quickly. The resolve is so sloppy that it hurts. It feels like Toby doesn't drive the plot apart from when he crashes into some flower trucks. The storm scenes are cool, and the whole concept and plot are sweet. It's just that sloppy, rushed ending that Toby doesn't really do much for. Also, can we touch on how Toby's windmill didn't use the windmill from the marshlands that we see in every single intro sequence? Why? Everyone that talks about this episode now thinks it would be a great idea, so why didn't everyone back then not take it into account? Well, they might not have had the set for it, and plus that windmill is so far away from the track that it would have been difficult to reshoot regardless. It is a shame, and I do agree that maybe something could have been done, but I guess that's one of the downfalls of season 7. Corporate espionage. Again, disappointing but not horrible. This episode is wasted potential. What I'm referring to is the scene where Harvey comes to help the twins, but they think it's the Loch Ness Monster. The suspense was great, but they drop it way too quickly. For the best part of the episode, this is way too short-lived. There's also some annoying arguing and irritating scenes in general, which leave it down here. I found this one very overrated. Yeah, I was way too nice to this one previously. What was I thinking? This episode's only okay at best. There's some nice use of camera angles, and the runaway is fun for a while, but it makes little sense as to why Reranked can't stop, as the sets on which the cool camera angles are used are just normal flat ones. The story's fine, no real problems, but it's not really that good honestly. Especially because there's another narrow gauge episode with a runaway. What a story. The tonal change is quite impressive here, going from Salty being mocked by Percy and Thomas to the Diesel fighting a fierce storm and saving a ship from crashing with some help from our boy Fergus. I do love that guy, I wish he was around more. But by the end we get the satisfaction that everyone appreciates Salty and that he'll no longer be mocked. Emily is very intriguing here. She's become really involved and has clearly gained some confidence since her debut. It adds a nice touch. This episode would be number 1, if not for what I believe our actual number 1 is. The best Season 7 episode. I see why people love this episode. It's an expansion to Oliver's character in a setting and direction not really seen before, as much as this really does seem like Thomas's arc all over again. Toad getting a role adds some great lines to the episode and makes the scenes much better. The crash, concept, and what happens as a result is also fantastical and ironic that it really is hard not to love. The real question is here though, how do those kids manage to build a snowman that big? Are they snow engineer experts? The world may never know. Another Arthur episode that further explores his character. However, this episode's still only okay. Thomas's crash is kind of funny, but everything around that and the ending are again very bland. It's just the tank engine whining about fish, because Thomas doesn't like fish, guys. Did you know that? It's not like he's had multiple stories exploring that very same hatred. This episode handles Arthur better and expands upon him well, which is why it's above the Spotless Record, but it really is just average at best. Duncan is okay here. The whole concept is so cliche that it just comes out feeling unfinished and not distinguishable enough to be cared about. The whole elephant statue thing is fun, but all it does is be heavy enough to cause a runaway. Why not have someone else take that train and have Duncan think the elephant's real and have him run away into a pond? By the way, that ending line,
Hooray for Duncan's mistake, cheered the engines,
is hilarious. I don't know why, but it just is. Overall, this one feels rushed, but ultimately fine. Murdoch looks cool. That's about it. His whole gimmick of preferring peace and quiet is so whatever. I think if they focus more on pairing him up with characters like Salty, it would strengthen the story a lot more. A story like Emily's Rubbish, where Murdoch tries to escape Salty, but can't, would have been much more genius. For once, the hit era did something right. Shocking. I know. To everyone that doesn't like this episode, I'm going to try and convince you now and then go and watch it. Hopefully you'll see what I'm talking about. I see Fergus as that know-it-all teacher's pet that's still gullible, but only when he connects the dots first and overthinks it beforehand. So when Fergus sees Diesel working at the cement works, he gets suspicious about his placement there, especially because Fergus has been the only engine to work from there for at least a long while. By the way, Diesel is so in his season 2 character here, being sneaky and snide. I love it. So when Fergus is told by Diesel that he's being kicked out, A, he doesn't want to disobey, and B, he already thought that in the first place. So Fergus leaves and drives the story to its climax, the smelters with Ari and Bert, who again are in character. Fergus runs off scared to this beautifully designed abandoned mine, so Thomas swoops in and saves the day. This gives us another really heartwarming ending and finishes off the episode with the assurance that nobody will be stealing Fergus's position anytime soon. What a great fucking story. So people who hate this episode, go and watch it and come back. Do you see what I mean? Let me know if I've converted you in the comments. What a great reintroduction to a villain. A redemption arc plotline is just genius and is a shining star for the season. Bulgy was always the superior anti-rail villain, and I think will remain that way until the end of time. His trials and tribulations on his first day back are quite amusing, and the whole concept of a vegetable bus is just so stupidly funny. How'd you even come up with that idea? What drugs were they taking? All in all, this one isn't too intense either, but manages to make it this far up here through the sheer insanity and humour the story offers. This episode has been bashed for being nonsensical, but then again, when has the show ever made sense? We just came from an episode where children made a skyscraper of a snowman, and the third ever episode has an engine being bricked up despite that realistically causing so much traffic. So stop slandering Harold's one good episode, please. We have some funny Percy lines and a plot and concept that's so wild and different that I enjoy it all the more. Also, Harold is surprisingly bearable here, somehow, so that too is a plus. For all of the confusing story beats this one has, I think it really has some entertainment value. It's an episode where you can just sit back, relax, and immerse yourself in the narrow gauge adventures that Scarlet goes on. That bastard balloon makes a reappearance, and it's still just as beautiful and makes the whole episode a lot more peaceful and dreamier. So Top and Hat's parts are funny too, adding some nice flavour into the episode. It's no Lady Hat's birthday party, but it does have legs to stand on, and a very immersive and tranquil vibe. The writers tried so hard to include Murdoch here because they forgot to give him a second episode, and it's so transparent. But let's talk about that. Runaway and Gordon, the true star of the episode. The Runaway, what causes it and what happens during it, is definitely something I could see in Audrey's writings. It's so charming yet exhilarating to watch that I love it. Gordon here though contrasts a bit to his character in Gordon and Spencer, as he's so dignified and uptight here, but so much like Edward in the other episode. It's such an odd character shift. Nevertheless, it's such a fun ride with a sweet concept that you just can't not love. This one is a fan favourite, and I can understand why. Spencer is another good character who's clearly had thought and effort put into his personality and design. Such a beautiful engine. Gordon also has an amazing role to play as well, becoming the Edward to Spencer's Gordon, as it were. The engine has come full circle, becoming wiser and a lot more helpful. He's finished his 7-season long arc, and the end result is this satisfying 4.5 minutes of gold dust. The beautiful winter scenery and the way it's used to the episode's advantage is clever. However, not much else is that good. Thomas and Elizabeth's dynamic is less unique than before, and is just a weird thing to be wrapping up near the end of the season. Thomas and Elizabeth was never really that important of a dynamic compared to Thomas and Percy or Thomas and Gordon. The crash is only okay, despite that amazing shot of Elizabeth sliding on the icy road. All in all, I don't think there's that much to say to an only average episode. By the way, I never noticed that in between shots, Thomas's train changes from coaches to trucks because of the reused shots from season 6. Such a big oopsie. Trusty Rusty is guilty of conforming to the Rusty is right, Duncan is wrong trope that the writers often use with the pair. Why couldn't this have been flipped on its head and have Rusty be in the wrong for once? There's a cool bridge collapse, but apart from that, what really is the point of the episode? It teaches the same moral as we've seen before, and practically nothing new about the pair's dynamic is explored. It's not horrible, it's just disappointing. What a sweet resolution to the classic era. It's a low-key, humble send-off that makes you glad you watched. What it lacks in story and intensity, it makes up for with the charisma it gives and the pride it makes you feel to be a fan of this amazing show. It was the finale we deserved, and I'm so glad it's the one we got, even if the DVDs don't agree. I'm glad they used the music from Let's Have a Race song back in series 3, because again, it gives a perfect send-off that references one of the best season 1 episodes